everybody, and welcome back to my channel. I am Jen. This is Fundy Fridays, and here on my channel I talk about different aspects of Christian fundamentalism, American conservative politics, pop culture, and gay stuff. And today I bring you an interview that James and I did with April Ajoy, who is a content creator. You might have seen her in the deconstruction spaces and the anti-Christian nationalism spaces. It's kind of all over the place. Makes really funny TikToks. She's an author, a speaker. She's got a podcast. She frequently collaborates with Tim from the New Evangelicals. And recently she wrote a book called Star Spangled Jesus, Leaving Christian Nationalism and Finding True Faith. And it's all about her journey from Christian nationalism. Like, she was deep into it, into that fundamentalist, evangelical, conservative world. She even worked for CBN, and she comes from a family of traveling evangelists, and yeah, she's just really walked the walk. And then she deconstructed and has become still Christian, but a progressive. And she has since deconstructed in every aspect, religious, political, social constructs. And she is a great ally. She's very left-leaning and progressive, and she speaks out against the dangers of Christian nationalism and racism and injustices, and it's just a really, really cool journey to witness, and I am so glad that we got to interview her today. And I do highly recommend this book because it is educational, it is insightful, it is scary at times, but it's also really funny, and April is a fantastic writer, and I am just really looking forward to seeing what she does in her career. And I hope you all enjoy this episode. It is just a little Zoom call interview. I needed to have something to hold us over because I'm working on my Halloween special for the year, which is all about Allie Beth Stuckey. And so that has been very stressful. So this is what we got this week, and I really hope you enjoy it. Stick around to the end so I can tell you all about the new Halloween merch that we have and all the self-promotion stuff. I'll save that to the end. So here we go. Today we are talking with April Ajoy, writer, speaker, all-around cool person, comedian, hopefully friend, and we're going to be talking about Star Spangled Jesus, your new book. First of all, look at the detail in the, what are those? Like those little...
Looks like little sequins.
Yeah.
I know I joked about it that they should make one with actual sequins. It's like reverse sequins. You can like...
Or the ones that you can like...
Yeah, like a little special edition.
That is so cute. It's funny, it's witty, it's educational, shocking insight into this world. You went through all of this, you've lived to tell the tale, and you're like a better person now. Like
trying to be.
Like,
yes.
Well, I often think, like, because I'm very opinionated and loud and I get angry about stuff all the time, and I'm always like, thank God I'm not a Republican, because like they could use me. Like I would argue really well. I'd be like Allie Beth, and that's kind of what this reminded me of, is you seem to have always been like smart, like funny, like very opinionated, and so it's really cool that you're using your powers for good now, because it sounds like, yeah, you wanted to be Tommy Lauren, you said.
Yeah, no, I had big plans to be on Fox News one day, be one of their little talking heads. But yeah, I'm like, I was so loudly Republican, and now that I'm like, oh shoot, I was quite wrong on a lot of things over there, that I feel like I need to be just as loud on this side now. But I look at it as kind of like my repentance, like repenting out loud.
I'm doing a video about Allie Beth Stuckey, and it's going to be like the style that I do. It's going to be long. It's going to be a biography, and try to figure out how we got here. And I feel like this book has been really instrumental in that, because it's kind of really showing you like what their lives are like. And
yeah, and like the mindset behind it. It's funny because she's got a book coming out soon.
Toxic Empathy.
And
I know. That's something I see a lot. I read, Jesus and John Wayne. And when it comes to like the hyper masculine Christianity realm, they also do the same exact thing where they say that the women are empathetic and women always vote Democrat, and that's why the men should be the ones that vote. And it just like they turn this like, oh, you have feelings, oh, you care about people. They turn that against you and make it a bad thing.
It seems so obvious being on this side of it. I mean, I wrote a sort of book when I was 19. I think I mentioned it, but I literally like rail against Christians who are quote too nice in it. Like so like that's like a thing in this idea in this movement. But it's funny to me now being on this side because like just imagine Allie Beth getting to heaven one day and St. Peter's like, "What did you do for God?" And she's like, "I wrote a book to Christians." He's like, "Oh, did you tell them to love their neighbor or to feed the poor, to welcome the immigrant? Like, what was the book about?" She was like, and she'd be like, "I told them to stop being so nice." Christians, generally speaking, have several reputations, but one of them is not for being empathetic.
But can you just give us kind of a general I also don't know. You wear so many hats. I don't even know which one you'd want to identify as the.
Yeah. So I'm April LaJoy, and I am an author now of Star Spangled Jesus, as we've established. And I'm a podcast host. I co-host the recap of the New Evangelicals with Tim Whitaker on this new episode every Friday. And then my main claim to fame, I guess, before this book was I make silly TikToks and videos like a content creator. Most of it is not serious at all. Like I talk about serious serious topics and issues, but I do it with humor and I wear wigs. Sometimes I dress in drag and I'm a youth pastor. I try to do it in sketches because I think, I don't know, humor is how I cope, but I also think when you're doing comedy, it can just disarm people a little bit more and make them maybe accept the message that you're sending a little bit easier. That's basically what I do.
Does your spouse have demons that you'd like to see them be delivered from? What do you do?
What a common issue we've all faced at one point or another. But before we can get rid of them, we got to learn how to identify them. So here are some simple ways to find out if your spouse has demons. Does your spouse go to work with a pitchfork? Have you ever woken up and found your spouse levitating in bed? Can they control fire with a snap of their fingers? How about your spouse being able to turn their head all the way around?
Did you say something?
If you answered yes to at least 2 of those questions, congratulations, your spouse has demons. Now what do? Throw a dance party and get ready for all hell to break loose.
You get so full of the glory of the Lord, you get into worship and you put on some praise so your spouse can't even stand to manifest his demons around you, and they automatically start to manifest out.
But I think also you are one of the best I've seen in this space at using humor to take down some of those structures and kind of parse them apart. It's always very life affirming to me to see your comment section is just loaded with active practicing Christians going, ha, youth pastors are weird like that though. Like, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is where change is happening. We're watching minds be changed in real time.
It is funny because a lot of my videos are more just focus on weird things of evangelicalism where people that are in it could still find it funny. So if like one of those goes viral, I'll get a lot of more conservative evangelicals that follow me because they see that video and they're like, this is funny. This is like church humor. I want more of this. And then I'll post something that's like about my non-binary spouse or, you know, that I'm queer affirming or something about politics or something that negative about Trump. And then suddenly like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you unfollowing. They like announce their exit. I'm like, okay, whatever.
And you get that moment where you're like, haha, you agreed to do that one
I
time.
literally was just about to say, haha, made you follow.
I know.
You're slightly more progressive than you thought you were.
Right.
That.
Like, see, like, and that's the thing too. Like, we can agree on some things, even if we disagree on, although I have a hard time with people that are like, I disagree and I want to take away your rights.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Like, that's a difference of disagreement because you're just like arguing with my human existence as a person. But yeah, so we can find common ground and that's where we can eventually make change.
Okay, I just wanted you talking for the camera about like how you grew up and like, you know, why you were traveling and all that stuff. Pretend I don't know anything.
So the quick highlights is I was raised, my dad was an evangelist and my grandfather was also a pastor of a large church in Dallas. My dad would travel. We'd travel on a motorhome across the country. We traveled all over the world. My dad would preach. I would sing. My mom would sing. My brothers would sing. It was a family affair. Sometimes I would sing on different Christian TV shows. And yeah, we were also very Pentecostal. So non-denom. My grandfather was an Assemblies of God pastor though, but left the AG over the politics of the board and stuff. So we used to have this joke, for all have sinned and fallen short of the Assemblies of God.
I love Pentecostals. They're one of my favorite.
Really witchy.
Yeah,
but
it's an easy jump if you were to go that way, you know.
And
yeah,
they're very
totally
friendly to movement in a way that, like, I'm so used to, like, other Christian denominations. It's like sit still, moving. Very like Pentecostals, they be moving.
It's interesting. I went to an AG college in Texas, in Waxahachie, and they had a no dancing rule. So it's Pentecostal. You could get fined $250 if you were caught just like dancing on campus, but you could dance and worship. Those chapels, we had chapel every day at that school. Every single day. And like you had to go.
Were they long?
Yeah, well, they were supposed to only be like an hour. It was the block, but Pentecostal. So
they got carried away.
Yeah, the guest speakers that would come in regularly would go long, and they would always be like, "This is more important than any education. You're spending time with the Lord." I'm like, I don't know. I'm paying a lot of money for this education.
I love to.
Nobody wants to hear about my time with the Lord. I'm trying to find a job.
You also got to be okay with suspense, because at any moment the pastor could just scream. Out of like, you could be like whisper and then suddenly screaming, or out of nowhere someone just starts sprinting around the auditorium, and
I just realized
you got to live on the edge.
Now, this is like a fucked up question to ask. I will take it back. Have you ever been like exorcised?
Like someone tried to cast demons out of me? No, but I have tried to cast demons out of someone else.
What's that like?
So I saw my dad. I saw my dad lay hands on people that we believed were demon possessed and cast the demons out. So my spouse, I mentioned, is non-binary. Before they came out, before we'd learned what that even is.
Okay,
like,
I already regret where this is going. I'm sorry.
I know. To be fair though, they were the ones that were like, I think this is 3 demons, and I was like, great. I'm a Pentecostal. I know what to do with this. So laid my hands on their head and just said, in the name of Jesus, be gone, over and over again. Probably, I think I spoke in tongues too. But spoiler alert, there were no demons. It was a failed exorcism. So either they're still in there or they were just not.
I think it wasn't failed, because now they get to be their true selves. So the demon was.
That's true. Maybe actually exorcise the demonic spirit of religion. Or dogma.
Well, I can imagine, like, that to me is something that I don't judge people for participating in, because like the attention feels good probably, unless you don't want to be exercised.
Right. I did do it with consent. I'm a big fan of consent, even in toxic religion.
And like, sometimes I feel like I have a demon in me, and it would be nice to at least believe for a few minutes.
Like that's just so. Yeah, I just think we've been taught that things about ourselves that may not always be positive, that they're just demons. But in reality, like, just being human is messy, and it's not always hard, and they're all parts of us, and none of them are pure evil and need to be gone.
Talk about your dad was such a prolific figure in that movement, and how it was really bittersweet and also really hard to deconstruct, knowing like, you love your dad so much, and you have all these fond memories, and that he was just trying to do his best. And so I'm sure all of that was really hard to think about.
You paint a very complex picture of your dad. Problematic beliefs, things that, obviously you would have trouble rectifying now, but also ahead of his time on a lot of stuff, or at least ahead, I guess, of his faith, maybe. Supported, you as a young girl and your interest in kind of taking on more leadership and front-facing roles. And just in general, I mean, if nothing else, seemed to be a very bombastic personality. It seems like your dad was someone who really focused on kind of the outreach ministry type of thing, like, and maybe kind of inspired you to do that, like finding the non-believers, not being afraid to take your faith into places where people aren't going to agree with you, right? And which, ironically, it sounds like ended up being a big part of your later deconstruction. Might have backfired on him a little bit. But I'm curious, how did your dad, when your dad would interact with people like that, who he maybe liked, even respected, maybe agreed with on a lot of stuff, but just didn't maybe didn't connect on that exact level of faith that he was looking for. How did he rectify those people? How did he talk about those people?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm trying to remember because a lot of those conversations I probably wouldn't have been privy to when I was a child. But I remember him talking bad about people who voted Democrat, right, for instance. But it wasn't to the extreme that we hear a lot today of like, oh, they're demon rats and they're led by Satan. It was more of like, well, they're voting that way, but they're misinformed on some things. And it was, it was still a little condemnation in there, but it wasn't like, I never heard my dad say you could not be a Christian and vote Democrat. He would have just said, you're probably not the best Christian if you do that, or you're just like a misinformed Christian, if that makes sense. But I heard it enough from like other pastors and stuff. Because one of the more interesting things was growing up where my dad was an evangelist and he would speak in all these different churches and I would go with him, or our whole family would, is like the meals where we would go out to eat with the pastor afterwards. And I would be like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and just listening. And you hear just all sorts of interesting tidbits, and a lot were political. He was really interesting because I feel like his bark was worse than his bite, and he could say some pretty aggressive, problematic, homophobic things from the pulpit. And early on, I think he was more homophobic too, because like we left the restaurant when there was a gay waiter, and I heard him say a lot of like really homophobic things. But then as I got older and was more in college, I noticed him kind of softening on that a little. Like he was not pro-gay by any stretch of the imagination, but he didn't seem, that wasn't his main focus in life anymore. And I think it's probably because he just had more interactions with people here and there. There were several times where we did have gay waiters and we didn't leave the restaurant like later on in life.
It's amazing what being hungry will.
Yeah, small progress. So to answer that, I don't know how he reconciled a lot of things because I think he probably had more questions deep down about certain things than he let on. But whenever he came face to face with someone, I only ever saw him treat that person with kindness, regardless of who they were, with the exception of like early on and like leaving the restaurant. Like I feel like as he got older, he became a little less dogmatic in person.
It seems like a lot of, the curiosity and the boldness that you bring to your career and have introduced to the deconstruction space, ironically, are things that maybe he helped build in you. So
yeah, no, 100%. And that's one reason like I dedicated the book to my dad, because he was such a passionate person. And the hard part is I know because I saw him beyond the pulpit too. Like he practiced what he preached. He was 100% authentic and genuinely believed what he believed. And it's hard to fault somebody when they genuinely believe that they're doing the right thing, but that doesn't negate the harm that was caused. And like, I think of my brother growing up in our household and, he came out gay later, but was gay the whole time, just keeping it a secret. And, I can imagine how many queer kids or queer people had sat in services where my dad would preach this really hateful message about queer people. And, so it's just like balancing that of like, I see the good in my dad because I knew him really close and loved him. And I know he loved me, but I also like have to recognize that things he did and said were really harmful too in moments. He also did a lot of good things. And I think writing this book, and I've intentionally not really talked about my dad in any of my TikToks or really in a lot of podcasts too, just because there's a lot of complicated feelings about him, and I had my first panic attack of my entire life writing this book because I felt like I was betraying him, like telling part of his story. And he's not here to defend himself because he passed away in 2011. But it kind of reminded me as I was writing this that just most people and most things too are just more nuanced than we usually give them credit for. And two things can be true. Someone can have a good heart and do some good while also being really harmful to certain groups of people. And, how do we live in that nuance, in that tension? I don't know if I have the right answer, but I try to portray, on two sides. One, if people read my book, and I hope that they do, that still are nationalist in some way in their faith, that hopefully they can see it as like a soft landing, that it's not I'm not shaming you. Like I believed these things too, but there's a better way, and you can change and you can start thinking differently. But also to just kind of humanize people that get caught up in this movement to people who aren't in it at all, who think everyone in this is just evil and they want to take rights away from people. And it's, I mean, yes, those things are true, but they're not evil. Like they think they're doing the right thing. And it's as backwards as it is that someone thinks they're doing the right thing by taking away your fundamental right, you know, to healthcare or to get married. They somehow do believe that. And so it's just like, and I think if we can all admit that there is more nuance to this and it's not just purely good or purely evil, then that's how we can actually start making change.
I want to say thank you for talking about your dad. I didn't mean to sneak that up.
Oh, no, you're fine.
But he reminded me a lot of my grandfather who passed away a few years ago. And that's how he came across, as a very, like I said, complex, because I deal with that too. My grandfather was the reason I was a Republican. I like to say I campaigned for W in 2004 and cast my first vote for Obama in 2008. A lot happened there.
Big change those 4 years.
Big change in those 4 years. And one of those was a year spent in college away from my grandpa, because he was not Christian. He was more of the J.D. Vance kind of nerdy Republican. He was and his thing, it was funny when you said his thing about Democratic voters was they were immature. That was his thing. He liked to say they're just immature. Mature people, when you have to pay your own bills and pay your own taxes, then you vote Republican. And he would say that to me, and I changed. And so we would, we would have those conversations, and he got rougher over time because I think a lot of us saw that ideological drift to the right wing. But he is also my grandpa and someone I care about. And so that I could see you telling a similar story in the book. I just wanted you person to person to know you painted a very beautiful, complex picture of your dad. So.
Oh, well, good. Thank you. I appreciate that. Sounds good to hear, because I was like, I don't want to come across like I'm vilifying him.
No, all I could think was, God, I want to meet this guy.
No, if the people read the book, they'll see.
Yep.
Yeah.
So. This is something that I love about this book. I mean, it's incredible, but one thing I love in particular about it is I just think it's a really important book for right now. There's a lot of people deconstructing, it seems like, all at once and kind of taking apart those toxic beliefs, but not a lot of roadmap for how to do that. I would argue that your book is one of the best roadmaps for kind of how the deconstruction process might look for a person who isn't, prepared for that or didn't expect that. I know we get a lot of messages from fans who talk about
I don't think anybody prepares for it, which is why when it happens, people are like, I don't even know how I got here.
And I would argue that for you were maybe perhaps the most prepared person I saw, just with your media background, and you can tell in the book that you've always been really thoughtful in how you approach problem solving. And so I say all this because you're also really open in this book about the things that you really kind of cringe about looking back on, and the beliefs you had, or the things you said, or the way you acted towards people that you didn't like. You're really open about that, and I think that's really important because we hear a lot of shame in that regard from people. So I guess I want to ask, what would you say to those folks who are just deconstructing? They want to be where you are, where they've kind of found really healthy ways to process that shame and use it for good, but they just don't know how. What would you say to those folks?
I think the best advice that someone gave me when I was flailing through deconstructing, once it hit me really hard, is to let go of the need to know. Be okay with not knowing certain things, because I think, especially when you're coming from evangelicalism, where, it's said from the pulpit, oh, you got to know that, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And there's no room for doubt. So we're taught from a very innate sense that any sort of doubt or unknowing is wrong. And so I think it's just almost an inherent instinct to have to know something. And that drove me crazy, initially when I was deconstructing, because I needed to know everything. I was like, okay, I know this isn't right anymore, but what is right? And I almost just stressed myself so hard trying to figure out what the right thing was. And then I came to this realization, I have my beliefs still today, but I hold them really loosely, because at the end of the day, none of us really know. There's no way we can know. We can say we know, we can lie to ourselves that we know, but even the people on the pulpit saying they know that they know that they know that they know, they don't.
There's been times where I've had to just deconstruct certain political beliefs or something.
Yeah.
And the first wave of, I might be wrong about this, is so scary that it makes you want to run away and like be like, never mind, I'm not going to think about that. And I can imagine that it's very similar, especially because you not only deconstructed religion, but all the political stuff and then all the, sociological teachings that you had. Like it's really an interesting way to look at it. I like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like deconstructing religion and politics, it's because they were so like interconnected. They became one. So if I deconstructed one, the other one kind of happened.
You're like, I don't have time to do.
I know everything was changing. Yeah, it was total existential crisis.
Can I just keep a little bit of my old worldview as a treat?
Some people do that, So you open up the book with a very, very good draw you in statement. You're talking about you were watching January 6th unfold and you recognized several people from your church. Did that kind of kickstart your deconstruction or did that kind of cement it?
I was deconstructing already. I think I really started when my dad died because we were also Pentecostal, so I believed in healing. So I think I'd been very, very slowly, like a snail crawl, deconstructing since 2011, just because I knew some things weren't adding up. But I was able to ignore a lot of those deeper questions until 2015, when my brother came out. And then also around that same time
what a time to come out.
I know. He came out like a month after.
I mean, that's kind of good though, because like then it was the Trump years and you wouldn't have wanted to be.
I got the timeline of the book wrong. I thought he came out during the Trump years. I didn't realize it was 2015. I can imagine him being like, man, at least things are getting a lot better for people like me. This was probably an okay time to, oh no.
Right. I know. He came out, well, in 2015, it was still primaries. So Trump was on the scene already, but he wasn't president. But he came out like a month or two after they legalized gay marriage officially. So that happened. But then Trump, really the whole Trump years, I was really vocally Republican and I got relatively silent on those years because I honestly felt like I was just constantly being gaslit. Like I felt crazy because I still had a lot of my conservative beliefs still, but it wasn't, I always really wanted to follow Jesus and the teachings of Jesus and like love my neighbor and the marginalized and the immigrant. And I was like softening on the more like hard right issues, if that makes sense.
You were compassionate conservative.
Right. I was compassionate conservative. I thought I could still be Republican and be compassionate. But then it was just like getting meaner and meaner and with Trump. And I kind of thought, I thought I was going crazy. It's like everyone around me basically told me that I was crazy. That they told me my late father would be disappointed in me because I could not vote for Trump in 2016. And so like getting that kind of vitriol from people that I knew, I was just already questioning things deep down. So 2020, I did vote for Biden. I had finally deconstructed enough to vote for a Democrat, a demon rat. So when January 6th happened, though, I was still like, I had a lot of questions. I hadn't quite figured out certain things. I hadn't pieced everything together quite yet. And seeing the people that I knew someone, and then Beecher knew someone, and we both knew them separately from church.
That's wild.
And then I just I saw the Jesus flags and like, Trump is my president, Jesus is my savior, or, I saw, they were praying at the Capitol. They were singing worship at some point, like in the crowd. And like, it just hit me. It was like, oh my gosh, I've been a freaking Christian nationalist this whole time, the whole time. And so like, it was just very eye-opening of like, oh my, if my life had gone a different direction, I could have been there. Because at first I was like, I don't know these people. These people are crazy. Like, what are they doing? They're trying to overturn the election. But then it's like, oh no, these are actually my people. And I need to sit with that.
As you're deconstructing, oh, well, what is life? What is, am I going to hell? Like what, all this other stuff that you're trying to figure out, like that's really hard. And I just think you're really brave. And I think it's really cool that you're willing to admit, like, I did this and it was kind of sketchy or cringe or something. And it's just hard to have to face all that. But I think you did it for a really good reason. And I think that a lot of people are going to be helped by this book.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. I think I didn't want to be that person that's like, oh yeah, well, sure, I said and did harmful things, but it's only because I was a victim of indoctrination, which, there's probably some truth in that. But I was like, I need to own the part that I've played and the harm that I've caused. And hopefully if other people see me doing it, and like it can be a very scary thing, just hoping to kind of like what you were talking about, just set the roadmap of like, this is how I did it. And I know everyone's different, but I'm hoping that some people that, maybe they're still a little nationalistic in their thinking can see their thought process and my thought process and start to be open to questioning certain things.
It's very humbling to use, a phrase from that world. I know when I realize I'm wrong about something, like if me and James are having an argument or something and I realize I'm wrong, it is very humbling to be like, oh, I'm not always right.
Not to keep bringing up your family, but I also know you mentioned just a bit ago your brother, how him coming out was a big part of your process as well. And I thought it was interesting the way the book is written. It felt like you were watching this slow process of thoughtful philosophical deconstruction happen over time, and then boom, and then there was a moment where
now what do you do when it's actually in your face
and very real very quickly. And so and this is just because you have such a unique background and all this stuff and such an interesting worldview. I just want your opinion on this. Do you think deconstruction by theory alone is possible, or do you think people need that human element, that they need something? What I wrote in my notes was something worth deconstructing for.
Yeah.
Or can you just do it on books alone?
I mean, I do think it's possible to do it on books alone. I feel like I know some people that have done that, but I think it's a lot easier and it's a quicker path if you come head to head with either someone in your life personally where their existence is a threat to your ideology, like just who, their being. Like for me, like my brother, he was gay. I know for a fact he would never have chosen that in the household that we grew up in. So suddenly I'm like, well, I know it's not a choice despite being told that. And I know my brother doesn't have a demon because I've lived with him. I've never seen him foam at the mouth, like there's never another voice coming out of his body. And so suddenly I'm like, okay, well, I know this isn't true, but I love my brother. So I am now willing to figure this part out, and I'm going to accept my brother, or I'm at least going to love my brother. I hate that it took such a personal connection for me to change. And I Beecher and I talk sometimes like, oh my gosh, what if your dad never died? And what if Andrew never came out? I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a chance I could have been at the Capitol on January 6th. That's like a scary thought that we're all just kind of a product of our experiences and what happens to us. But I do think having that personal connection helps, as messed up as it is. But when you love someone, you're already just going to be more willing to question beliefs, which are an intangible, in order to keep that person who you love in your life.
I will say I had a bit of a motive with this question, because I was going to say, I think for a lot of our fans too, we talked earlier about how people are trying, like, how do I come out of this? How do I rectify my old beliefs? Well, you might be the person that pulls somebody else out of it now. And so that's why it's important to talk about this stuff and, put your deconstruction out there and talk about it, is because, like you said, it is theoretically possible, I think, to, like, some people are just so thoughtful and will just consume every book that eventually they'll get there on their own. But a lot of folks, they won't get there if they don't know someone who's going through that process ahead of time, or know someone who needs them to go through that process ahead of time.
Love is just really powerful, and it can change you in really good ways.
Yeah.
And your book, I think, just more than any I've read, really showed that process kind of happen in real time in a way I really appreciated, where it's like, I'm learning, I'm figuring it out. Oh, every couple of pages, something doesn't sit right with my faith, and then bam. It was a very poignant moment. That long period of deconstruction before it made that moment so much more poignant in the book.
I'm glad. Thank you for sharing that with me. I also strategically kind of put the queer stuff at the end in case a conservative accidentally got it. I'm like, let's let him get through the whole journey first.
Once you get most of the way through the book before you start yelling at me.
Well, it's kind of like how the politics of that group manifest anyway. Like, most Christian nationalists will say, oh, I'm not racist, and they'll admit that was bad. I mean, even the Southern Baptist Convention apologized for their racism. But then there's that next mountain, if you will, that needs to be climbed, which is the queer stuff. Yeah. And so it's interesting where it's like, hopefully we'll see a change in our lifetime, but I'm not crossing my fingers. Like,
I hope, anyway, maybe I should say I hope, but I also think that in 50 years, most churches in America will be affirming, and just like the trajectory that we're going, because just statistically, all these white families, like, unlike what Trump says, no one's just going to turn another race one day where you have to reconcile with your racism. But these white families do have queer kids that are going to come out at some point. And so, and there's plenty of Christians who double down and kick their kids out and abandon them. And that is tragic. And I absolutely hate that that happens. But I do see a lot of families go on that journey and be willing to try to like question beliefs because they love their kids. So that's why I have hope in it.
A lot of Christian nationalists, evangelicals of that type, don't realize how much of their beliefs are tied up in what will get somebody else votes in an eventual election.
Right. Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, I totally believe that anytime you're in a evangelical church service and someone's like, you need a vote on quote biblical values, that is a dog whistle to vote Republican. And if someone says they're a Bible believing church, that means that they are anti-queer.
That's been the phrase.
I was going to have a musing, and if you could translate that into a question.
Let me see.
All right, I think we got a good team.
This is why we work together.
Okay, so with your grandpa talking about it's immature to be a Democrat, and then with like the toxic empathy of Allie Beth, and like you talked a little bit about this in your book about the real loving, when you believe this, the real loving thing is to tell them the truth, to tell them you're going to hell, you're sin to be gay, all the things that you need to tell them. It reminds me of, and I've heard this before, of the tough love, like Christians with their tough love principle. It's very condescending. It's very like, we know something that you don't. When you come to our side, you'll know the truth, like, because it's very truth-based. And it just reminds me of like
the whole love the sinner.
What is the deal with that? What's the deal with that? Is there a pattern here?
Because the pattern is you want to be loving. Like if you were raised in a Christian environment, we are taught love your neighbor. Like that is essential. Like even the most evangelical fundamentalist churches will still teach love your neighbor. But you have to hold cognitive dissonance if you are trying to love your neighbor, but you're also being like, deport immigrants, like then suddenly you have to be like that pastor that's like, actually, that verse is only about loving your Christian neighbor, and then suddenly you're doing mental gymnastics.
I think you explained it really well in your book, better than I'm able to explain now, of how Christian nationalists, like why they treat people disrespectfully and claim it's love. It's because they're taught that is a loving action to do this, but also people are fallible and sometimes kind of shitty. And so anytime they have the chance to kind of be right in a situation, or I told you so, or like, I know something that you don't, I think that they use that as an excuse because they've been taught that's also a loving action.
Oh yeah. Yeah, totally. As long as they are telling the truth, no matter how hateful it comes across, they can justify it in their head as love because they are trying to save that person's soul by either telling them about hell or telling them that they're in sin or telling them to repent. Like, even if it's like the rudest comment in the world, it's like, well, I told them the truth. So that's love.
Well, it creates that feedback loop that we sometimes talk about, I think, where, when the truth feels more painful and it's more aggressive, it also tends to feel more truthful. It kind of devolves back into that very common Christian ideology now of if it hurts, it must be correct. If it's unpleasant, you're doing it right. And I think it leads into this situation where you're also getting really uncomfortable confronting people with these things that you're maybe even struggling with, and you're having to do so more and more aggressively to try and perform this purity that you're not feeling inside. But at the same time, the more it hurts, the more it feels like the truth. So you get this really strange feedback loop that I think is that loop snapping is what a lot of people are calling deconstruction.
Well, and also on another point, people can be super mean to others, especially online. We see, the meanest comments that I get are from Christians, which I still identify as a Christian. They would say that's incorrect, that I'm just a Jezebel on the way to the flames. But
you a Bible-believing Christian.
I just read Exvangelical, and they were talking about that to be evangelical, it's more about defining what you aren't than what you actually are. So that's what that would be. That's one of the reasons why they can literally assign somebody not a Christian,
right?
Because it doesn't fit their description.
I know, because their faith is so politicized. Because I don't follow their political ideology, I can no longer be a Christian. But I do not consider myself evangelical because of the I can't do it. But one thing that also happens in that loop, when they say something mean to someone, tell someone to repent, and then that person might respond by saying, oh, you're just being a bully, or you're a bigot, or, if they say anything somewhat mean or negative back, then they take that as persecution and they wear it like a badge of honor. Like they're now like the good little Christian soldier and they're being persecuted for their faith. But really, they were just being a bully and someone stood up to them. Like that's not persecution.
Because they don't think the thing they said was, well, maybe they do
right.
think it was mean. When it comes to like stuff like abortion, it reminds me of when you were talking about in the book, like the legislating morality and the part that where you go from just being a Christian with opinions about stuff to we have to legislate and take away your rights. That's where it becomes nationalism. Like you have to do what we want, our leaders, our laws, no deviation. And I just wanted to know if you could elaborate on the difference between nationalism and just like being just having a strong opinion about something.
So I think the difference is like, hey, I cannot do this because it goes against my beliefs. That is totally fair. But then saying you cannot do that because it goes against my beliefs, that's nationalism. That's saying like, now I'm going to control you, complete stranger who has different life experiences and believes different things because of what I believe is true. Because nationalism is promoting the ideology and legislating one specific worldview at the detriment of others. There's no room at the table to even have a conversation about it. Whereas on a small scale, like you can believe abortion is murder if you believe that all babies in the womb are sacred and that keeps you from ever having abortion. Or even if you want to try to tell people in your life, like, hey, I really believe like this is going to be like killing an innocent life, like that's not nationalism. That's just you holding to a belief that you have and sharing that on a small scale. But you're not going to someone and being like, you are not allowed to do this thing, even though I don't know anything about your life, but you just can't because this is how I view a fetus, which can be a fine line, especially like when it comes into voting and like you're voting for people who would take away those rights. But that's kind of like why I talk about it too, because I don't know if a lot of people that vote, that are conservative evangelicals that vote Republican, like really know how extreme things are getting. Like, I think it's, they don't want to know because they want to view themselves as good people. And if they're seeing that the things that they are voting for and cheering on are actually harming people, then they have to reconcile, their complicity in that. So there's going to be people that will refuse to even see how their nationalism is harmful.
I think that's interesting because it is totally like cognitive dissonance. Like we know on the outside, like it's counterintuitive to what Republicans want. They don't want big government in making all these different decisions, except for when it's their thing, then of course they want it because it goes against the individualism and the refusing to acknowledge that there are systems at play, because I don't think they want to rock the boat. I think a lot of times it's more about what your peers at church think of you than what you actually believe. I hear all the time, especially when it comes to like combating systematic racism, they go, well, it's a sin issue, not a skin issue. And so it makes me think, well, why couldn't you apply that? I mean, not that I agree with that, but like, why couldn't you apply that to abortion? Like, I thought we were just trying to convince individuals not to have them. And now all of a sudden you're trying to make this a federal thing.
Right. They say the same thing on
like it, right. But what the hell does that have to do with me?
Right. And especially with how they address guns too. They'll say the same thing anytime there's a mass shooting. It's just a sin issue. It's not a gun issue. But then with abortion, it's like, no, we must save lives. And, which I honestly think is because an unborn baby, like a fetus, is the easiest person to advocate for.
Yeah,
they don't talk
back. It's all
back.
Potential.
Right. It's all potential. It's all. And at the end of the day, they can go to sleep thinking, I'm a good person because I am saving babies.
They did their part. They voted. They're trying to stop murder, but only at the surface level does that actually be true.
Right. And it's a super easy way to feel good about yourself, because if you can, quote unquote, save a baby, you've saved a baby, and then they completely forget about that child. Whether that child ends up in foster care, whether that child, is impoverished, they're constantly wanting to take away money from impoverished areas and welfare programs and healthcare. There's a ton of cognitive dissonance. And I honestly think part of it too is when you are in a really fundamentalist worldview, you're not happy. It's a pretty miserable existence to constantly having to question every thought you have as whether or not, is that a demon? Is that a sin? Is that me? Or is that God? You know, is this person in my life? Did God send this person or did Satan send this person? And then you're constantly holding your faith with like white knuckling it because your beliefs are you're you know, they're holding on by a thread. Every person you meet is someone that their blood might be on your hands if you don't save their soul, you know, or if you become friends with a gay person and you don't tell them about Jesus, like, are you enabling their sin and then they're going to go to hell? And like, it's not fun. And I think a lot of people heavily like repress their natural desires because they've been taught that they're sinful when in reality they're just human. Mm-hmm. And I think there's this almost envy when they see people like gay people or trans people or, you know, or women out there not having children. They see that as a threat to them because they're happy, they're living their lives and they're choosing to live in a way that they've never given themselves an opportunity for. Like, I think there's an envy of that freedom that's out there. And, you know, I think it was the Heritage Foundation sometime recently, they had posted a video of this lady who was talking about abortion. And the reason why they want to ban it is basically to put consequences back on having sex. Mm-hmm. They don't like that women can go out and have sex with no consequences because that goes against the whole like patriarchal belief system. So at the end of the day, like, yes, I think a lot of them genuinely believe that they're saving babies, but there's something underlying too. Because I think it, like, even when I was super pro-life, I would have never said that I thought women who had abortion should be put under the death penalty. Mm-hmm. You know, so like that alone shows that I didn't actually believe it was murder.
How did you feel about it? Or I guess I would say, how did your church justify social programs? Like, why is it bad that the government wanted to help people or, you know, provide social programs or assistance when that's like the whole point of Christianity?
Yeah, we would say that's the church's job, not the government's job. And when the government is intervening in that way, it's basically a Band-Aid and doesn't actually solve the problem. And that what we should be doing is, you know, instead of giving a man a fish, teaching a man to fish and, you know, get people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So it's really not like a Jesus following teaching, but it's a very Republican teaching.
We've talked about a lot of stuff, but haven't talked as much about Christian nationalism. And I know that's a big centerpiece of the book, obviously. Towards the end of the book, you discuss how systemic problems are particularly hard to address with like evangelical Christian nationalists. Your systemic racism, systemic sexism, things like that, because it kind of flies in the face of both, you know, American exceptionalism and also the individualism they tend to lean on to explain away anything that doesn't fall into that worldview. So I'm just curious, as someone who very clearly, you know, never lost that outreach spirit and is still kind of interested in engaging with folks who, you know, you don't see eye to eye with now, but maybe could in the future, maybe could deconstruct. Have you found any particularly effective ways to talk about these systemic issues or to kind of show them the puppet strings without it being just completely rejected wholesale?
Yes and no. Like, I haven't found a way like this works every time, you know, because everybody's different. And I think there are some people that are more open to hearing new ideas than others. But the most effective way that I've found happen, one way it helped me too when I was still in it, even if I wouldn't have admitted it in the moment, it, you know, planted that seed, is just to ask them questions and get them to explain their point of view and why they believe certain things that they believe. Yeah, I would hear a lot of people sometimes that would say like, oh my gosh, you know, in 20 years, white people are not going to be the majority anymore. We're going to be the minority. And like, you know, they say it like it's this terrible thing. And then it's like, why does that matter? Like, why would it be bad if we were the minority? Get them to answer that question, but not do it in like a gotcha way, but just be like, you know, I understand, like, I hear the fear in what you're saying. Like, why do you think that would be bad? Like, what do you think would happen to us if we were a minority? Maybe like a roundabout way they could see like, oh, maybe it's because minorities are mistreated in our country and there's like a systemic issue around that. Or even with the abortion issue, like, hey, I think you and I both want to lower the abortion rate. Like we would love to have abortions be unnecessary. Why would you think banning it is a better option as opposed to just making a wage livable and providing healthcare and providing comprehensive sex ed? Like if comprehensive sex ed and having access to birth control and free and accessible, that is proven to lower abortion rates more than bans. Why do you think we should still just do bans? And just get them to answer. A lot of times they don't believe facts. That's hard. But one thing that really worked on me was that the abortion rate goes down under Democrats more than Republicans. And after Roe v. Wade was overturned, the year after, the national abortion rate actually went up.
Yep.
And just saying like, hey, I want to lower abortion rates too. We tried the bans. It went up. Maybe we should try other things, like is there another way that you would be okay with, and just have them get them thinking. That's because I have found that if you just point the finger and say you're an idiot or you're wrong because blah, 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 that makes them shut down and they're not going to hear anything that you say.
But I think there was something there that is kind of like as close to a universal rule as we might get, which is use material from them, not the other way around. You can't start with stuff that's important to you. Like you can't, if someone's not keyed into systemic racism, then talking about that might be brick walling. You're just kind of, throwing effort away. But if they're really into abortion and that's an avenue you can engage with them on, that's where change
really into abortion.
You know what I mean as a topic.
I was going to say it reminds me kind of like talk therapy, where you're just kind of like, the questions you ask are very important because it gets them kind of leading in the way you'd want them to go.
Right.
You have to realize it on their own.
Right. It's kind of like, with family, like I'm a very stubborn person. And if Beecher's like, you should do this because I think this will help you, I'm like, who are you to tell me what I should do? But if my therapist is like, I think you should do that. And it's the exact same thing. But suddenly now I'm like, oh yeah, because I've like come to this conclusion on my own in therapy as, with my therapist. Like, it's just the way humans work.
Less serious questions too.
I love it.
I was going to ask about January 6th.
The duality of interviews.
Let's do a sandwich.
Well, I was gonna highlight because you mentioned earlier, and I said foaming at the mouth too. One thing I really appreciate that you talked about was that one thing I noticed, you were a devout evangelical Christian. You've believed all of it. You were not about to say bad movie or performance was good.
Yeah.
No matter what. That was one thing I appreciated. You're like, this movie sucked, and I hated this too. And I particularly appreciated your hatred or your distaste, I guess I'd say, for I think I got this right, Heaven's Gate or Hell's Flame.
Oh, yes. Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, yeah.
And
Trauma.
I'm curious. It seems like over the past couple of decades, they've really been like this horror movie version of hell has taken over a lot of this Christian nationalist evangelical space. What do you think that's doing to that community? Is it like, I feel like it's going to make you some really devout 12-year-olds, but then it's going to like fall apart real hard when you get older, when you're like, oh, the world is complicated and it's not this cartoonish screaming thing.
I think that's something that's been happening for a long time, and you see a lot of people deconstructing right now. The thing about hell, it's a really good, it works as a fear tactic. Like it probably kept me from questioning things longer than I would have normally, just the absolute fear of burning alive forever. So it's helpful. It's worked for them for a while. But yeah, at a certain point, you can't believe that you worship a God who loves you unconditionally, but then has conditions over whether or not you burn alive forever or not. I'm like, I don't know. And then the people that are like, well, you've asked that question, like, well, you just don't understand God. His ways are above our ways. I'm like, I'm not sure I want to, if that's love. But that is one reason why you see a lot of Christian nationalists right now, and they have been for decades too, but fighting public education and fighting, basically people going off to college because like you went to college and you became a Democrat. You were
happened.
Yeah.
You are the story that they tell the prodigal son in church. You know, you go to college, your kids suddenly vote for the Antichrist Obama. But that's part of it, is that if they can keep you in the echo chamber and keep you indoctrinated, then you won't leave the belief system because you're so terrified of hell or the rapture or all these things. And if you don't have any outside information or any sort of just other worldview being told to you, then it's really easy to stay in it. But with the internet, I think that's another reason why we're seeing a boom in deconstruction, is because people have all the information in the world at their fingertips. And so I don't have to go to a library and get an encyclopedia to read, you know, the annihilationism theory on eternal damnation. You know, like I can just Google it and I'm like, oh, there's actually other Christian ways to view hell that's non-eternal conscious torment. And that, you know, and then I guess that's a slippery slope that they tell you to just not believing in hell at all anymore. But, you know, what do I know about that?
When you're deconstructing, I hear a lot of people bring out the unfair things that happened when they were a kid that they just felt that were like you talk about, like, oh, I don't like my faith and I want to, you know, take this apart and I don't want these harmful beliefs. And also it really sucked that I couldn't go to that Harry Potter party when I was 9. You know? And I'm wondering, like, as someone who went through that process, how much do those kind of like childhood letdowns or things you didn't get to do or the stuff you missed out on, how much does that kind of fuel the process too?
Yeah. I mean, I guess since I'm deconstructing it, as you know, so many years after the fact, I've kind of like, it's not as personal, you know, as it was, but it's just kind of a grief of, which for the record, I had a really good childhood. I had a lot of fun. Like, I loved my family, and I'm fortunate that I had to give up a lot of stuff, but I also got to, I had been to 30 countries by the time I was 18. So I got to do a lot of things that I wouldn't have done without this belief system also, so I think it's a little bit different for me because I'm like, well, yeah, I gave that up and that sucked, but also but I think the hardest part for me was more like when I got to high school age, because that's when I started to really feel how different my family was compared to other families, even though I had gone to like a Christian school or a Christian high school, like that Harry Potter event. All my friends were from my Christian school, and I was the only one who couldn't go.
That feels like an extra special punishment.
Right. I'm like, we're all Christian, but I'm like the worst type of Christian, I guess, because I'm like, can't do these things. I mean, yeah, it sucks. I will say the nice thing now is like, I have 2 daughters myself, and sometimes I look at them and I kind of envy the childhood that they're getting because they have no idea who Satan is. Literally the other day, my daughter asked, what is hell? She had heard that word. And so Beecher is trying to like explain hell. She's 8. She's like, well, hell is a place that some people believe really bad people go when they die. Some people believe it, but a lot of people don't. And she goes, oh, so that's what Lizzo means when she says, what's that song?
Good as hell.
Good as hell. Yeah, she's like, that's what Lizzo means when she says good as hell. And Beecher's like, no, that's not what Lizzo means. So
I bet that was refreshing.
Yeah,
it was. I was like, oh, she didn't hear it.
Broken in real time.
Yeah. So it's like, oh, that's so great. But it's also a little scary too, because like I know what my upbringing produces. I have a lot of anxiety sometimes, but I think maybe that anxiety might have kept me out of some bad situations because I was just like so terrified of sinning and going to hell, you know? So I'm like, I know what that produces. Yeah, it's a lot of trauma, but I came out of it and I'm relatively okay now, but it sucked for a while. But I have no idea what we're like the parenting we're doing now. Like, I don't know what this produces. We're just like shot in the dark, hoping for the best.
Well, it's all part of that not knowing. You know?
Just
have to live your life one day at a time.
Once you become comfortable realizing you don't know anything about what's going on, you feel a lot more friendly to everybody else not knowing what's going on either. And so you can approach those brave new frontiers a little less, abject terror than that Christian nationalist worldview forces on you.
The rapture anxiety too. That was
Yeah, you had a story about you were scared that your family got raptured.
Yeah, I legit thought I was left behind. It was seriously traumatizing. And every once in a while still, to this day, if I don't hear my family immediately and it's really quiet, like for a split second, my brain goes rapture. And then I'm like, no, I don't believe in that anymore. Stop it.
Well, it's also like the implication there is everyone's raptured and I'm not. And so not only are you facing your fear of, oh, it's happening, but also like, wow, everyone was right. I am a horrible sinner and I'm not going to be raptured. And so you're having to deal with all of that in like a span of 2 seconds.
I will say, too, if you want to prank someone who believes in the rapture, you can fill blow-up dolls with helium, and then they'll just go right up.
I love that.
Get like 10 to 15 of those, let them out of a big, truck bed or something.
We should do that for like whenever they predict the next rapture, which will probably be next month sometime. But we need to gather around a date where they're predicting and get a bunch of people to just like, commit to 3 blow-up dolls each. And then at the same time, we go out and let...
You made a little video, anti-Obama video with your friends for Romney.
I did.
Not official. This was a fan edit.
Yes,
can you imagine if TikTok was around at the time? Would have been making Sigma edits of Mitt Romney.
I know. I'm a little bummed that the internet was around because that stuff's out there. But I'm glad it wasn't to the level that it is now. I would have had a lot more receipts though, because I get a lot of comments from like conservative evangelicals today that were like, you were never a conservative, and then I'm just like, okay, well.
It's crazy. It's like you're bearing your soul in this book, talking about all these like regrets in your life, and they're like, you're never a Christian. Like
you were never conservative. There is a big part of me that wishes that was true, so I wish you'd stop saying
no, it's not a flex, sir.
But okay, so something that you can find footage of online is you at the Jim Bakker show.
So yes.
So for those of you that have been following me for a while, you know that I have a very conservative Christian nationalist past, like the time I sang an original song on the Jim Bakker show.
Tell me about your experience, and then I'll tell you about my experience.
Okay. I was 18, so I was young, just graduated high school, ready to change the world for Christ, And at the prior year, my dad had written a book called America Say Jesus, and the whole thing, there was a petition in there for George W. at the time to say Jesus more. And we believed that if America didn't start defining her God, who is Jesus Christ, that God would lift the veil of protection on our country, and the country would experience bloodshed. So we went on this bus tour it had America Say Jesus all over our 40-foot motorhome. And then I wrote a song to go along with it, also called America Say Jesus, very Christian nationalist song. And I sang it on the Jim Bakker show. So my dad was also on the show talking about the book. And then I sang my little song. It was a very interesting experience. Even when I was still very evangelical. I really didn't know much about Jim Bakker because I was pretty young. He was popular before I would have cared.
So this was like, what, 2008?
I think it was 2006, I think, was the year.
Was he selling the buckets back then?
So I was on pre-bucket, but he was selling a sword.
Yes!
I wanted to tell you, I went and looked it up. You can get that sword on Amazon now, by the way. It's about $150.
Oh my gosh.
We'll probably put it up. You can get the sword of Solomon.
So what was it? He like knighted your dad or something?
I mean, he didn't knight him, but literally right before I sing, I'm like prepared. I'm on my little mark. There's tape on the ground in the studio. And then Jim's like, oh, I'm going to gift this to you. He was selling it for Father's Day. It was Solomon sword. And he's like, I'm going to gift this to you. And you just see him it's a huge sword. No, it's not
it's
small.
Like a broadsword. It's a...
Passes it down to my dad. And I remember thinking, even in the moment, I was like, why is he giving my dad a sword?
Men will do anything except apologize. He's like, it's just sword.
Here's a sword. Yeah. After my song, though, they played one of their studio ads. Like you could tell they made it in-house. I think it was called a Revelation Generation Emergency Backpack. And it had like a bunch of cups in it that say like Jesus loves you on them, and like a little red flag that says help. And I think there's a Bible and some like water in a package that's supposed to last 7 years. In case the apocalypse happens. So yeah, he was selling those. So he was still doing the apocalyptic stuff back then, just not the buckets.
Okay, so we went there.
Did you like go in?
Okay, so we went because we went on Easter. I'm gonna look you right in the fucking eyes when I tell you this. Jim was not there.
Oh.
Well, the one required work days.
Oh.
Christmas, Easter, and maybe Lori's birthday. I don't know. But you have to be Christmas and Easter Christians. I was told you would be here, Jim.
Wow.
So I went to the compound, hard to get to, like they hide it, and I knew they were filming, so we went in and like the like you couldn't get through. Like I'm assuming there's a place for people to stay because we saw like a dad like smoking a cigarette on a balcony.
Oh.
Well, I guess he probably stayed on the bus.
Yeah, we did not stay on the compound. I did.
Never been to church. I was not raised Christian at all. Did my first communion during this church service.
Were they shooting that day? Like, is it one of their shows?
I'm looking for it. Because we sat in the front. I was being a little stinker because I was like,
we were trying to appear on camera. We weren't making any secret about it. Do you know what the date was?
They updated this in a long time.
Yeah, because they're not paying anybody out there.
That's you?
That's me. That's the back of my
head. Oh my gosh, y'all are swaying.
Hold on, I'm gonna turn around at some point.
Y'all look into it.
I looked at the camera a couple times.
I was like, I need to make eye contact with the camera so they know that I'm doing this. But I'm like, they invited us in. They were nice as all hell.
But you talked about a wrestling show that your family did. And I was gonna have James ask more questions about that because...
Well, I was just curious. That was kind of because you talked about like it sounded like they set up a ring. They had a little like wrestling. Was this a one-time thing, or did they do this often?
My dad, I know had done it at least one other time. He had done it at other churches. This was the first time that we were old enough to do it with him. So we were in Singapore when it happened, and I was 17 at the time. Yeah, the local church brought in a boxing ring. And we had demons and angels. But one of my brothers, the one who came out as gay, he was the demon of greed. And it's funny though, one of the demons, the sin was free sex. Literally just said free sex. It was like, as opposed to, I guess, paying for it's okay. You just don't want to get it for free. That's when it's a sin.
You pay for it with your soul, right?
Yeah. But yeah, so my dad, it's this whole play where he boxes this Satan, who is my other brother, Matt. And it's funny though, I played the sign girl who like round 1, round 2, I would like come through. And the guy who played Jesus, so there was actually a chapter in my book specifically on purity culture, but it got cut because I was over my word count. So I tell this story. I actually think it was probably one of the funnier chapters too. So maybe I'll have to put it out there or I don't know, at some point. But it's like my dating in the Christian world is a whole other like weird thing. And there's like purity culture tied in with Christian nationalism too, but it's just not as obvious. So I got cut. But the guy who played Jesus was an American missionary there. And I had it like, we were vibing. Do you know what I mean? Like I was like, he might be the one for whom my soul loves. And we had a thing. And by thing, I mean, like we held hands during a prayer meeting. And then one time we held hands just walking. Like we were walking on a road and it was Singapore. So it was very safe. So you could pretty much go to the whole country. Like my parents just let us frolic around, but my brothers were always with me. So it was me and my brothers and then this guy. And one time he held my hand because my brothers were walking ahead and my one brother turned around and looked and then he let go. That was the extent of our physical contact. I just want that to be like, there was no sexting of anything. It was just like very, very pure flirting. And then like that one handhold plus the handhold in the prayer meeting in a church service. And then at the end of the 5 weeks that we were there in Singapore, it was our last night there. And he comes to say like goodbye to my family. Cause my dad was a big fan of this guy too. Cause he's like a missionary. It was like dream, whatever. And then I walk him out, I hug him goodbye. He gives me like the quickest side hug and just sprints away. And then later that night he had messaged me and was just like, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Satan's been using you to distract me from God's calling.
Bro.
So.
That's worse than like just being ghosted.
I was like, I felt so dirty too. Cause it's like, I didn't feel like I was being used by Satan and like, we didn't even do anything.
Yeah. You could have just said nothing.
Yeah. Just like I was literally leaving to go to another country, but yeah.
Yeah. You could have had a nice clean break.
Right. No, he had to tell me that it was Satan. I'm like, great, cool.
So there's the whole memory. I can throw the whole thing out wholesale.
Thanks. Yeah. It really tainted the summer, romance, if you want to call it.
One thing I really appreciate, because Jen and I are kind of, we talk about, we're a bit weird in this space because neither one of us grew up religious basically at all. And we both kind of come to it as like tourists almost. And we try to acknowledge our relationship to the space. And I wanted to thank you because one thing I noticed you did in your book was define some common Christian terms that folks like us may not know. I know you mentioned like fellowshipping and you explained what that meant, that's just socializing. And we often joke about how there are some fundyisms we've found that just don't have a good parallel in secular life. I'm still looking for a good way to use, like, season of life. What an incredible phrase. I still use that. I have no parallel. So I'm curious, what do you use some of that language still? Do you have a favorite fundyism that still permeates your language?
Yeah, I can't let go of season to save my life. I still to this day will be like, well, I'm just in a season of waiting. Like, no matter what.
Because it's a good word. It just so it's an amount of time.
Right. Right. I mean, I guess maybe with Taylor Swift now you say era, but
yeah.
I like season better. I like season. It just feels more calm. Era feels too big and grandiose.
Well, era's kind of like denotes that it's like by itself. Like you could say, I was in my Christian nationalist era, you know?
Right, right. That's true. Yeah. I'm trying to think of other ones. I mean, there's so many. I usually, if I use them, it's more as jokes, like, you know, you need to repent of, you know, whatever stupid thing that had just happened. You know, hedge of protection. Anytime,
I've
like,
never heard that one.
Beecher leaves, I'm like, pray a hedge of traveling mercies. You know, you know that one. But I think I use them more as a joke. If I don't, it's still subconscious and I haven't caught myself yet.
We'll also use the Lord put it on my heart, which is basically me saying, I don't know why, but I think you should do this. And I don't have a reason for it other than...
I will still say, I just feel in my spirit.
There you go.
Yeah,
I think we have a spirit somewhere. There's the indomitable human spirit.
We've talked a lot about Christian nationalism here at the end, but it's just not very often that we get someone, you know, talking to us with the, I would say, unreplicatable life experience you have in engaging with this topic. It's just, you can't fake it, right? And so we've talked a lot about it, but of all the things we haven't talked about, or even if you just want to hammer another point again, which is totally fine, for people like us who are a bit disconnected from that mentality, who are looking at it very distinctly from the outside, what do you think is the most important thing for us to know about the current spread of Christian nationalism?
I think it's the biggest threat. Christian nationalism is the biggest threat to democracy in America currently. I mean, I wrote a book that's funny, like it's humorous, and I make funny videos about it, calling out the hypocrisy, but it is a very real, dangerous ideology. And the people inside of it, they have power, they have money, and they seriously, if given the opportunity, would turn this country into a theocracy. And Project 2025 is not a joke. So that's why I think voting is very important. And, you know, even if Trump loses and Kamala wins, which fingers crossed, Christian nationalism is not going to go away. This ideology has been around for decades. They're the closest that they've been with, especially with how the Supreme Court is stacked. You know, I don't like fear mongering. I think I have an aversion to it just because I grew up with so much fear mongering. But because I grew up and I know how seriously they take it, and they are, most of them, I believe, are true believers, and that in a lot of ways is scarier because they believe they are on a holy quest. You know, I don't think Trump himself, I do not believe, is a Christian nationalist. He is an opportunist and a narcissist, and he is using Christian nationalism because that is who is, white evangelicals are still going for him 82% right now. Like, that's his backbone. They're going to, I think they're going to be hands in the pot. He's going to do what they want because that's who's giving him the power.
Yeah, the fight is not over, basically.
To end on some more hope, if I can change, anyone can change. Just going a little more up.
Well, we're so happy that you're, I don't even know how you would identify now, but I'm glad we're talking and you're here in our lives.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so great to finally, you know, meet y'all in a face-to-face situation.
Yeah.
Maybe one day it'll be like in real life.
We're not that far away.
Meet space soon. No,
yes.
I often
go to the ark
joke,
again.
I often joke meeting incredible folks like you who have lived these lives of fundamentalism and kind of come out the other side with a story to tell. You all are the kids they really shouldn't have angered. the church they should have kept y'all placated, but they didn't, and we're all blessed to have your knowledge and what you're doing in this community taking place. You really are a leader on this deconstruction side, particularly for, I think, some of the people who have the hardest time deconstructing. I think yours is a voice who they will listen to even when nobody else is being paid attention to. So I just am really excited we had you here.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I appreciate y'all reading the book too. Like these were very, I can tell you read the book based on your questions.
I took notes,
I appreciate it. Yeah.
And I have a hard time reading, and it was
well, we'll have to have you back on sometime because I do have more questions. I want to know all about your time at CBN and all that stuff.
Oh yeah, Pat Robertson. Yeah, we will definitely do this again.
Yeah.
So
I'm telling
Star Spangled Jesus, everybody, check it out.
I got raging ADHD, and it kept me engaged for 2 days. She's one of the best storytellers I have ever seen.
I'll put your stuff, just April A. Joy on everything.
Yep.
I love this book.
Love her. Love you. We'll talk soon. Well, I sure hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know I enjoyed being in it. And if you want to support the channel, we do have Patreon and YouTube memberships. They do the exact same thing, except for YouTube, you get special emojis in the chat. And another way to support us would be merch sales. And so we have some new merch. This one says, my pronouns are child of God. So if you want to express yourself that way, totally available. Also available as a sticker. That was designed by my childhood best friend, Gweepers. She is a tattoo artist, so the designs are kind of tattoo style, and I think it's great. Then we have Stinkin' Witch, designed by Lauren Marvell. And this one is a reference to Greg Locke. Remember? Stinkin' witch! I want to use it in my wife's Bible study. I'm going to find you, stinking witch. And there's a little black cat, which, speaking of black cats, I will bring him out in a second. But this shirt, also by Lauren Marvell, is called Bite. And it is based on a real-life picture of my baby boy. He likes to sleep with his belly out and his arms outstretched and his big teeth. And he does bite. So this is a shirt based on him. And he's right over here. I know. I know, baby. So this is Abe. And he is huge and sweet. He does bite, but I don't blame him. He's just trying to protect himself. He said I get picked up all the time because I'm beautiful. So that's my baby boy, and that's the shirt that is based off of him. He's got to, you know, he's got to pay his way around here, and so we use his likeness. I know, you went down. My baby. Okay, so yeah, that's the new merch. That's available at fundyfridays.shop. There are all kinds of cool designs that I am considering as a part of Halloween/fall collection, and so we still have Vampire Hoe, also by Lauren Marvell, and Funky Fridays, which is by Max Haller, and those all have sticker equivalents, and if you use code Halloween at checkout, you will get $10 off your order. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm going to be working my ass off. I'm going to be in the tank dealing with Allie Beth, and like it's going to be the Halloween special because I'm not doing Jill Rodriguez anymore for Halloween, and so I basically get to dump all of my creative energy into that one, into the Allie Beth episode, and I've already lost a large portion of my mind, so that will be fun. And then of course James has a Halloween episode coming up this year, which is Hulk Hogan. You could argue that he has been kind of training his entire life to do an episode about him. And so I wanted to give him as much time as possible to complete that. So I'm going first with the Halloween episodes, and I hope you enjoy it. I know I need to get out of my head. That's basically what the little short film at the beginning of the Halloween specials every year is, like me working out something psychologically that I need to work out. And this year it's very meta because I'm going to do like a Shining parody, and I'm going to be a writer that has writer's block, except I'm not going to kill my family. But anyway, I hope you guys are Having a good fall, and I will see you around, and go check out April's book, and go follow her, and I hope you have a great weekend.